Okay, but our current Break Combined series is meant to explore the shared challenges and history that connect the city and the country. And today we'll hear about two authors that were forged in our nation's most storied rural to urban exodus. The Great Migration defines what is considered urban in this country to this day, and Richard Wright and Ralph Ellison are two of the greatest voices. Here to discuss these two authors are Candace Waid and Kenyon Gradert. Candace Waid grew up in East Thomas, graduated from Phillips High School, and was honored to speak beside Margaret Walker, noted writer and Richard Wright biographer, for the inaugural lectures at the Lynn Henley Civil Rights Research Library. And Candace wanted me to remind y'all that this is the library downtown near the old Birmingham jail. And her work on Wright and Ellison and Faulkner posits a reverse slave narrative in which protagonists journey south to open wounds toward freedom. Professor Waid has given talks on race and history in Canada, Mexico, France, Denmark, Spain, Japan, Jackson, Mississippi, and others. Kenyon Gradert is assistant professor of English at Stanford University. His first book was a study of American anti-slavery writers, and he's currently at work on a book about the rediscovery of the American writer Herman Melville. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Dissent, The Baffler, and more. Thank you both for being here. So Kenny and Candace have each prepared talks around 25 minutes, maybe less, maybe a little more. So we're going to hear from Kenny first, and then Candace, and then we'll have a little period of discussion as a group after, and then, maybe on the side. Kenny, I'm going to give you the floor.
Sounds good. Thank you. Thank you for having me. I've been craving these kinds of small, intimate, intellectual gatherings, so thanks to Daniel, Danya, Priska, Kevin, and anybody else I'm missing for making it happen. I'm very excited to be here. Also excited because I'm a big fan of Ellison's work. So my plan for the next 20 minutes or so, 3 parts. First, I'll give an overview of Ralph Ellison's life and his work for those of us who may not know much about it or may not have read much. Next, given the topic of this panel, I want to look at some famous disagreements he had with Richard Wright over race and politics in the US. And then I'll wrap up with some of my own thoughts in terms of why Ellison today. Why do I think it's still good to revisit this writer and these disagreements today? So that's the plan. First off, some bio. So Ralph Ellison, he was raised by a single mother. His father died when he was young. They were both of his parents were from South Carolina, but Ellison always proudly considered himself a Westerner. He was born in Oklahoma City, raised there in the 1920s, and he often mentioned his pride at being a Westerner. But the South, always thinking about the themes of the Great Migration, the South always held a special place in his imagination. He even when he was a young child, he said he envied classmates who would go off to the country or go south to help relatives with the cotton harvest, because they would come back with all these traditional black stories and songs that he really craved. So it was always a special place, sort of as the ancestral homeland of black America for him. He got a chance to experience the South for the first time himself when he was accepted to Tuskegee Institute at the time, now known as Tuskegee University, Booker T. Washington's renowned all-black university at the time, including an all-black teaching staff at a time when many of the HBCUs were staffed by oftentimes white New Englanders who had come south to teach there. They needed a cornet player, and Ellison was a very talented musician, and so he got accepted to play cornet in the band. He initially wanted to study symphonic composition, and Tuskegee had a renowned composer there, William Dawson, that he was hoping to study with. But there was one problem. Once him and his mother paid for his uniform, his school fees, everything else, they didn't have enough money for a bus ticket to actually get to Tuskegee. So Ellison's idea was he would hobo. He would ride the rails to get there. And this was 1933, which was an incredibly dangerous year for a black man to try riding the rails to get to Tuskegee. In Decatur, Alabama in 33, there was a new round of trials going on for the Scottsboro boys, 9 young black boys who were arrested and sentenced to death for the alleged rape of 2 white women while they were riding the rails. The Communist Party of the US and the NAACP intervened, repealed the decision, kicked it up to the Supreme Court. But in 33, these new round of trials were going on in Decatur, Alabama. So Ellison's mom pleaded with him, just wait a year, don't ride the rails right now, let's wait until this calms down. Ellison was itching to get to school, so he didn't listen. Rode the rails and did have a run-in with some railroad bulls in Decatur, ironically in Decatur, Alabama. Had to hide underneath a loading dock for the rest of the night, and it really terrified him and stuck with him. He dramatized this experience in some early short stories. But eventually he made it safe and sound to Tuskegee University. Met a cold reception from William Dawson, the composer he wanted to study with, and he eventually would grow disillusioned with what he felt were the campus's respectability politics. But he really hit it off with his English professor, Morteza Sprague, and the school librarian, both of whom introduced him to the classics of English literature, but also the emerging modernist movement. Some older moderns from at Tuskegee, he read Melville, Twain, Dostoevsky for the first time, and his librarian friend introduced him to the emerging modernist movement. T.S. Eliot was a hero of his, Hemingway was a hero of his. He was reading James Joyce from the Tuskegee Library in 1933 when Ulysses was still banned in the United States, okay? So his experience, he got a better library at Tuskegee than he would have had at a lot of other places. And he was very proud of this later in life. He said, quote, "Why should I have wished to attend the white state-controlled university where the works of the great writers might not have been so easily available," end quote. So overall, Ellison's experience of the South, at least after that initial riding of the rails, it was much more positive than Richard Wright's experience, I think, and that shapes his vision of the South. Ellison wrote, "In time I was to leave the South, although it has never left me, and the interests which I discovered there became my life," end quote. Ellison leaves Tuskegee in his 3rd year to go to New York. He never finishes his degree. He goes to New York because he wants to be an artist. Initially thinks he might want to be a sculptor. There he is taken under the wing of Langston Hughes, the sort of unofficial ambassador of literary Harlem and the Harlem Renaissance, and also becomes good friends with Richard Wright. Hughes and Wright, they not only introduce him to literary Harlem, they introduce him to the Communist Party of the United States, in which they were both very active. So they kind of mentored him in Marxism and literature alike, and they were formative influences. Richard Wright helped Ellison get his first publications in New Masses, which was the magazine of the Communist Party at the time. And really from the late 30s into the early 40s, Ellison, he got very involved in communist politics himself. He was a committed Stalinist, and for a long time, frankly, after a lot of other people had pulled away from Stalin. He went so far, just to be frank, to defend the Moscow purges, Stalin's pact with Hitler, when a lot of other leftists were pulling away. And his reasoning was he felt that the Communist Party in the US was the only true force for racial equality in the United States. So that's one argument for why his loyalty stayed that long. Okay, but into the later 40s, after the war, Ellison, as does Richard Wright, starts pulling back from the Communist Party. Okay, and he starts pulling back from Richard Wright, his former mentor. Ellison later reflected, quote, "I felt more complexity in life," end quote, "than what he saw in Wright's novels." And quote, "I felt that Wright was overcommitted to ideology. I was much less a social determinist," end quote. The eventual result was Ellison's own novel and magnum opus, Invisible Man. It was published in 1952. It won the coveted National Book Award that year, beating out East of Eden by John Steinbeck and even The Old Man and the Sea by Ellison's hero, Hemingway. Really did launch him overnight from obscurity into literary stardom. It's been frequently ranked as one of the best novels in the English language of the 20th century. I would go so far as to rank it as one of the great American novels of the 20th century, if not the great American novel of the 20th century. It's never gone out of print since then. So a little bit of overview of Invisible Man. If you've not read it, it's written in the first person. It's told from the point of view of a nameless, idealistic young black man who experiences a series of identity crises and this kind of downward spiral of disillusionment until he bottoms out on reality and kind of has a revelation. Yeah. So Mr. Invisible, Invisible as critics often call him, he starts as a student at a prestigious all-black university in the South. It's a barely veiled portrait of Tuskegee. It's got the statue of Booker T. Washington and everything. And he starts off at the university hoping to become a member of what W.E.B. Du Bois called the upper talented tenth of black America, to be a credit to his race, as the phrase often went. But the inciting event gets underway. Invisible embarrasses the university when he chauffeurs a wealthy white benefactor to the forbidden backwoods of the black sharecroppers that the university is ashamed of. He gets expelled by the university's president, who suddenly reveals himself to be quite ruthless and Machiavellian in his strategic subservience to the white world. So, expelled, Invisible, as Ellison himself did, he heads to New York. He's disillusioned, but he's hoping to find some new kind of identity in Harlem. Immediately, he struggles to find work. He's caught between white unionized workers who suspect he's a scab and non-unionized black workers who think he's after their jobs. When he's not struggling with that, he's being pulled in all different directions by an orchestra of characters who are all vying for his ideological loyalty. There's his kind Harlem landlady who tempts him to settle down into traditional domesticity. There is a West Indian black nationalist named Roz the Exhorter who urges Invisible to sign up for armed black revolt. There are white women with black fantasies who are literally trying to seduce him. And then eventually Invisible gets adopted by the Brotherhood, which is another barely veiled portrait of the Communist Party in New York. But even if he eventually even gets disillusioned with the Brotherhood, he starts to slowly feel that he is invisible to everybody around him, black and white alike. He feels that everyone is eager to use him for their own ends or their own visions of life, rather than to see him and to acknowledge who he is. And as Invisible's disillusionment deepens, the plot gets more chaotic and the style gets more impressionistic in a really cool way. Eventually starts to get, even as the chaos in his mind starts to swirl, the style gets surrealistic and even Kafkaesque in the final chapters. Eventually Invisible embraces the chaos in his mind and becomes this kind of trickster figure who fuels the flames. He literally retreats underground while Harlem burns with riots sparked by the Brotherhood. So underground, Invisible bootlegs electricity to Blair Louis Armstrong, which was a favorite of Ellison's, so I asked Daniel if he could play some. And to power thousands of light. This actually ties nicely to the last talk. He's stealing energy from, what is it called? The Monopoly, I'm forgetting, it's something Monopoly, on the edge of Harlem, although the company thinks he's still in Harlem, and that's a symbolic point he's making too. But to power thousands of light bulbs to, quote, confirm my reality. He feels that everybody, his invisibility eventually gets so into him that he feels like he's doubting his own identity. So he retreats, steals electricity to lighten up his room and confirm his own identity. Initially, and he kind of bottoms out with this existential crisis. He says, "Who was I? Quote, how had I come to be? I believed in nothing," end quote. So he's literally hitting bottom, trying to figure out where to go from here. And initially, he's so angry about his invisibility that he's half tempted to kill those who refuse to see him. Believing, he goes even so far as to believe that it would, quote, be in the highest interests of society to kill the racists and be done with it. But then, in a reefer-fueled vision, he's confronted by a vision of an old slave woman who confesses that though she hated her master, she so loved the boys produced by his rape that in a strange way her hate for him began to mix with something like love. This really makes Invisible furious. He says, "You should have hated him." Quote, "Still, I loved him, but I loved something else even more, freedom." Invisible is deeply offended by this too. Quote, maybe freedom lies in hating, he says. She says, quote, nah, son, it's in loving, end quote. And with this same mix of love and hate, she confesses that she poisoned her master gently before her sons, growing up and sort of seething with Invisible's same rage, murdered him more cruelly and painfully. It's this very complex mixture of love and hate, almost this strange mercy killing. And Invisible's very confused by this vision and the complexity of what's going on here. So he sets out to write his own story underground and try and figure out, sort of make some sense of the chaos in his mind. But the act of writing leads him to a similarly complex vision of love and hate for America. This vision is summed up in a riddle that's been nagging him the entire story, a riddle told by his grandfather, also a former slave and a militant in the Civil War. His grandpa always said, quote, live with your head in the lion's mouth. Overcome them with yeses. Undermine them with grins. Agree them to death and destruction, end quote. Invisible puzzles over this, and he eventually concludes what his grandfather meant is maybe that black Americans must not only take responsibility for, quote, the principle on which the country was built, that all men are created equal, but even, quote, the men who did violence to this principle, that is, the racists and white supremacists who ruined themselves and their country. Like it or not, everyone was, quote, linked to all the others in the loud, clamoring, semi-visible world, end quote. Invisible concludes. So as Invisible is remembering these two former slaves and their complex blends of hatred and love for America, he finds his own initial hatred somewhat softened by love. Quote, I've set out to throw my anger into the world's face, but the very act of trying to put it all down has confused me and negated some of the anger. And so I condemn and affirm, say no and say yes. Though I have been hurt to the point of abysmal pain, hurt to the point of invisibility, in spite of all of that, I find that I love. I sell you no phony forgiveness. I am a desperate man, but too much of your life will be lost, its meaning lost, unless you approach it as much through love as through hate. And so I denounce and I defend. I hate and I love. End quote. Invisible says he isn't sure if this makes him a conservative or a progressive. He says he'll leave that up for the Marxists and the Brotherhood to decide. But in the novel's final line, he makes a confession. Quote, it is this which frightens me. Who knows but that on the lower frequencies, I speak for you. The novel's opening word is I. Its closing word is you, with a question mark. If you put those together, I think you get Ellison's vision of life. I, you? This idea, perhaps Invisible is more like others than he himself can see. Perhaps others are partly invisible to him. Perhaps all of us are partly invisible to each other, hidden behind social conventions and expectations. So that's the final line. That's my summary of Invisible Man. It's surreal, it's dark, it's funny, it's an act of hate and love mixed together. Ellison blends jazz and vernacular black culture with high modernist experimentation. He blends myth and symbolism with social realism and satire. I love it. If you haven't read it, you need to read it. And he wrote it at the perfect time. The novel's anti-communist streak delighted Cold War liberals and conservatives alike. With some mix of sincerity and perhaps some opportunism, Ellison continued to cultivate this image of himself into the Cold War after the success of Invisible Man. He refused to republish his old writings in the new masses. He groomed this kind of image of himself as what the Cold Warrior Arthur Schlesinger called the vital center of American politics. And he was amply rewarded. For the rest of his life, despite never writing another novel, he lived on guest lectureships and speaking engagements at Harvard, Princeton, Bard, NYU. He hobnobbed with establishment white writers and politicians. Into the 50s and 60s, his politics start to move rightward, his snobbery starts to grow. He cracked homophobic jokes about James Baldwin. He didn't show much interest in supporting African decolonization efforts into the 50s, even when Langston Hughes was urging him to do so. Into the 60s, he didn't much lend his reputation to speak out forcefully on behalf of civil rights. In the later 60s, he kind of outright mocks black nationalists and the black arts movement and mocks their calls for black studies programs at universities. And in turn, he always faced some backlash from black writers. In the words of one black novelist, John Oliver Killens, quote, "The Negro people need Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man like we need a hole in the head or a stab in the back," end quote. Black radicals frequently attacked him as an unreliable ally in, according to them, Ellis elevating aesthetics over politics, quote, "all that art for art's sake crap," in the words of Richard Wright. Hey, I don't think that's fair. But I do agree with Ishmael Reed. Ishmael Reed especially blasted Ellison for positioning himself kind of as the white literary world's sort of black token while rejecting former mentors and sabotaging the careers of younger black writers. Reed's pretty fierce in his critique, but I think there's some legitimacy to it. So all of this came to a head in 1964, somewhat humorously, I think, when Ellison accepted a challenge to match wits, not with another black writer, but with Irving Howe, one of the leading members of the New York Intellectuals, a group of young Jewish socialists. So Howe published an essay that has since become a bit infamous, Black Boys and Native Sons. In that essay, Howe praised Richard Wright for writing true black protest literature, and he critiqued Ellison for shirking his duties as a black artist to do likewise. I told this story to Daniel, and your response was the chutzpah. This kind of essay, I don't think it would ever get published today, and maybe it was true back then because Howe published it in Dissent, which was his own magazine. Ellison responded with his now equally famous essay, The World in the Jug, which some of you may have read, in which he defended the right of black writers to write as they pleased, and their duty, in his eyes, to capture the complexities of black life rather than only the kinds of protests that socialists and black nationalists wanted to see. Ellison wrote, quote, "When Irving Howe looks at a Negro, he sees not a human being but an abstract embodiment of living hell," end quote. And he goes after Richard Wright too a little bit. And when Richard Wright created Bigger Thomas, his tragic doomed protagonist from his best-selling Native Son, quote, Bigger Thomas was presented as a near subhuman indictment of white oppression. Here, environment is all, conceived solely in terms of the physical, the non-conscious. "Well, cut off my legs and call me Shorty," Ellison says. Wright could imagine Bigger, says Ellison, but Bigger could not possibly imagine Richard Wright. Wright saw to that, end quote. So, and Ellison conceded, yes, life in Jim Crow America is often brutal for a black man, but, quote, "He is no mere product of his socio-political predicament. He is a product of the interaction between his racial predicament, his individual will, and the broader American cultural freedom in which he finds his ambiguous existence. Thus, he too, in a limited way, is his own creation," end quote. So readers today tend to agree Ellison won the fight. Even Irving Howe later said as much himself. Later, Ellison further developed these thoughts about art, politics, and race in the U.S. He argued all good literature is minority literature because, quote, "the individual is a minority," end quote. And he argued all good literature was protest literature. Cervantes, Shakespeare, Dickens, Dostoevsky, Twain, Melville, Kafka, quote, "all of these embody protest," end quote. He went even farther in an essay from 1970 titled What America Would Be Like Without Blacks, where he revived the by then outdated metaphor of America as a melting pot. Quote, "The melting pot did indeed melt, creating such deceptive metamorphoses and blendings of identities, values, and lifestyles that most American whites are culturally part Negro American without even realizing it," end quote. He argued the converse was true of black Americans, more culturally American and European than they or their white compatriots often acknowledged. So, to wrap up, why Ellison today? I'll give you my 2 cents. I share many of Irving Howe's politics, frankly. I too have written for Dissent. I also find Ellison's politics and behavior into the 50s and 60s oftentimes reactionary and opportunistic. And it irks me that Ellison is still routinely lionized by certain liberals and conservatives whom I find distasteful. People like Norman Podhoretz at Commentary, Thomas Chatterton Williams at Harper's, William Tuttleton at the New Criterion. All of these critics have lionized and lauded Ellison as the solution for present-day identity politics in kind of cheap ways, I think. But to risk opening a can of worms, I also think that Ellison anticipated the present quagmire that we are in over debates about identity politics, and I think his arguments on this front are among the more enlightened that I've encountered. In my eyes, he inaugurated a tradition of black thinkers who tried to thread a tricky needle, rejecting both ethnic chauvinism and radical assimilationism, both uncritical hatred toward America and uncritical love of America, embracing the beauty of one's ethnic heritage while also recognizing that it can look different to others and blend into a larger American story, look different to other members of that ethnic group. Ellison's dear friend, Albert Murray, who was an Alabama native, he ran the ROTC program at Tuskegee for most of the 50s. He later on, after he himself sort of retired from the military, moved to Harlem himself, became a writer. He clarified and sort of built on a lot of Ellison's thoughts on this front in his book, Beyond the Americans. There was recently, I think 2020, it got reprinted, and Henry Louis Gates Jr. wrote a new introduction to how formative it was for him. It's a really great book. To this tradition, I would also add Gates and, in England, Paul Gilroy, sort of emphasizing the importance of sort of ethnic history, but also its hybridity and fluidity. Beyond the identity politics stuff, and more importantly, I think, for tonight's talk, focusing on literature, Ellison achieved something that none of these thinkers, not Thomas Chatterton Williams nor Irving Howe, ever did. He wrote a truly great American novel. And I think if you consider yourself some kind of leftist or progressive, wherever you are on that spectrum, or maybe you're not on that spectrum, I think we always need an occasional reminder that even if you believe, as I do, that art is inherently political, it can't ever be reduced to politics. Even Karl Marx, according to his daughter, quote, used to say that the poets were originals who must be allowed to go their own way, that one shouldn't apply to them the same standards as to ordinary people, end quote. Friedrich Engels, he warned against what he called Tendenzliteratur, fiction that sacrifices complexity to political messaging. Even Lenin reportedly preferred the bourgeois works of Pushkin to more orthodox Soviet writers. And the great American critic Edmund Wilson, himself a committed leftist, he cited all of these examples to make the point that, quote, the man who tries to apply Marxist principles without real understanding of literature is liable to go horribly wrong. In works of the highest order, the purport is not a simple message, but a complex vision of things, which is not explicit but implicit. And the reader who does not grasp them artistically, but is merely looking for simple social morals, is certain to be hopelessly confused, end quote. In an interview with the Paris Review in 1955, Ellison doubted that Invisible Man would be remembered for long. Quote, I failed of eloquence. I actually agree with it. I think Richard Wright is a better prose stylist at the sentence level, especially in Black Boy. I failed of eloquence, and many of the immediate issues are rapidly fading away, end quote. But, quote, if it does last, Ellison said, it will be simply because there are things going on in its depth. I hope so, anyway, end quote. So, to wrap this thing up, yes, Ellison's politics were debatable. Yes, I think Ishmael Reed is right that his career was stymied by success and some ego. But in Invisible Man, he captured the beautiful, the ugly, the fluid, the often absurd nature of American experience. He used ritual and myth and symbol to shape the chaos of his moment into something more lasting. I think Invisible Man persists because it gives us something far more valuable than polemic. It gives us something new. It gave us a work of art. Thank you.
Thanks, Kenny.
So
let's go to Candace.
thank you, Professor Kenny G. And I believe there's something to be said for us going underground and stealing power, and giving some thought to that. Because it's the one book, people come south and they die after they go north, like Quentin Compson and Sound of the Fury. But Ellison is the one person that took everybody up to Harlem, so that when things were better, one could just go upstairs. All right, so there's a PowerPoint for this, and we're just gonna fly without it tonight. All right, that means there'll be some extra reading in this for you, hearing of reading. In the final 18 months of his life, Richard Wright wrote as he had always written, as if his life depended on it. It did. Riding toward death in November 1960, Wright, at 52, chose a Slavic armor. He wore a writer's carapace of 4,000 haiku. In the beloved Lives of the Poet genre, this social realist walked the finite streets of Paris. He was seeking home. He carried all of those poems, all 4,000, as they accreted on his person. As this legend-inspiring commitment to the poetry weighed and comforted him, haiku allowed him to travel light. Travel light, as he told his daughter Julia, 5 syllables first line, 7 syllables second line, 5 syllables last line. You can do it, Julia. Right? Like Emily Dickinson, who wrote over 2,000 poems in 1862 as the Union was failing, Wright lived with the understanding of that. Emily Dickinson goes by first lines of her poems. They don't have titles. He understood, like Dickinson did, after great pain, a formal feeling comes. The best first line out of Emily for Richard Wright is, "My life had stood a loaded gun." Right. So he wore his poems as an armor in a world that was out of meter. Writing to the end, he chose 817 of these poems for his book titled Haiku, confirming his act of creation and haiku's subtitle, which is echoed in a line in Black Boy. He talks about there is another world, and the subtitle that he chose was This Other World. Wright's writing provokes. His early life was lie-soaked washed of the folk culture, whether seen as solace or as lumpen proletarian props. This means that this is more strict. He was brought up more strictly and more strict than Calvinism, as we will see. He was brought up by a strict Seventh-day Adventist family. They were often hungry in Jackson, Mississippi, Memphis, Helena, Arkansas, Memphis again, and later upriver in Chicago. While desire for milk and the smell of cotton seeds roasting permeate his world, this ramrod church was the backbone of his early life, the hunger-laden backbone of his early life. Lawrence Levine notes the dominating presence of hunger in Black Boy. As the sports gathered to regale in proto-dozens to signify in detail what they had to eat for supper. How many of you know what the dozens are? They're squealing, cutting, Bessemer, Alabama, cracking. I can do them for you now if you would like, and some people would leave the room. So we can, I don't do the dozens or even the 10. I'm not doing the dozens now. This is like a side note. But if you keep on talking, you'll bring me in. If you keep on talking, you'll make me mad. I'll tell you about the brothers that your mother done had. The last line's mine. Okay. Otherwise, it's traditional entry. All right, so hunger. This said, Wright's struggling family oddly possessed a rhyming dictionary, a work that was not considered to be a gateway to hell. This rhyming dictionary makes a cameo appearance when he is isolated to write prayers. And so in 1945's Black Boy, if you got a chance to read the first and second chapters, that's fine. You would see that there are three extravagant breaks into form. Richard Wright's memoir erupts from the brutality of racism's harsh realism to the diabolical beauty of poetry. These pages in length ruptures into form anchor clusters. They feature a near death or imagined death, the death of an animal, and he is also the killer of an animal, and a journey. In the first two clusters, the young Wright is nearly beaten to death, and he is a vulnerable animal, and he is also the killer of an animal. By his final dive into anaphora, Wright makes peace with the power of the mother in a journey accomplished through a spoken and heard story. These dream sequence matrices, these are clusters in the book, repeat the story of Wright as an animal to frame the extravagance of what it means to have poetic release. This excess of repetition calls attention to the writing and the presence in his life, hardtack life, criticized by Ellison, of beauty. Wright writing in particular in that in these three divergent floods of anaphora. Anaphora just means repetition and coming back. In these explosions in that book, he declares that he is human. Certainly Wright's 1940 novel, Native Son, establishes the scene of what could be called Western culture's crime. This is the Cartesian mind-body split, known here in its human-animal divide, and also an animal-human joining. This just means that you see women not below the waist, but below the neck. All right, that explains Descartes. All right, humans are animals, and Black Boy is driven by questions concerning what we should call here the person-human binary. Wright went back to Mississippi in his mind to ground and justify Native Son for those terrified by his Chicago-trapped, rat-killing, and woman-decapitating Bigger, spoken of by Kenny G. And while there are others, Black Boy's other of these defenses, Black Boy is Wright's longest and most personal explanation of what drives his terror-provoking Bigger. Between 40 and 45, there had been a mean time. To state the obvious, the race-hysterical, race-bitten United States had been distracted in yet another hellscape interval, this one known as World War II. I'm pausing because the papers are sticking together. All right. Like Frederick Douglass, escaped slave, writer, and activist, Wright was a ready listener. Douglass, captive, listened for talk of slavery. Wright listened to understand the life and death stakes of words. Compelled to write across the silences that kill. Wright listened, raging to the prophylactic quiet of ready violence. Some people told me that you all would not know what prophylactics were. And, you know, I just believe in birth control in North Alabama, so I'm okay with you all. And his essay on Richard Wright, Ralph Ellison uses black music to explain his friend and contemporary. The blues is an impulse to keep the painful details and episodes of brutal experience alive in one's aching consciousness, to finger its jagged grain and to transcend it, not by the consolation of philosophy, but by squeezing from it a near tragic, near comic lyricism. Ellison anticipates Deborah Miranda's genealogy of violence, and that genealogy of violence explains how people within the last 200 years, and the place where I teach a good bit of the time, were taught to whip and to assault their children with whips. that the genealogy of violence, that's something that had to be learned by the Chumash peoples of California. The valley where we are now was a hunting valley. If you're doing an acknowledgement of the valley here, it would be people passing through in a state that was so lush with water that there couldn't, there were so many village sites that were better than Birmingham. All right, no offense to anyone. All right, so scarred black boys, and Ellison writes about this, why black children are whipped. Scarred black boys might survive to become men. Death was experienced by Richard Wright, not in the way that death comes to all, Romans 5:11, but in the way that Robert Johnson's Hellhound on My Trail haunts the vulnerable. The hellhound sings to those who must watch and listen, not just lone men, but families that must keep moving or hide as if or because their lives depend on it. They do. ICE is here, ICE is coming. And these extravagant narrative ruptures, unlike anything in the book, Wright's pages stream into anaphora, coursing as rivers of would-be poetry. Black Boy explodes from brutal experience, explicated knowledge of what it means not to know, just not to understand what's going on, and it cuts to the diabolical beauty that's freed to flow in these extravagant passages. His explosive form, in the book, all three of them total 66 anaphora, just a breaking out of the social realist frame. This is best known by us all through Martin King's Rhetoric of Repetition, urging the progression towards social justice. So anaphora is just coming back to that same set of words before that leads to a building exhortation of power. I have a dream. I still have a dream. And I have the lines here. I have a dream that somewhere in the red dirt of Georgia, I have a dream that somewhere, that someday in the state of Alabama, black children and white children will hold hands as brothers and sisters. Also, if you read the I Have a Dream speech, it's anaphora pretty much all the way through. Now is the time. Now is the time. We will understand and we will move forward, no matter what the fatal state of the United States is. So Black Boy opens with the 4-year-old Richard Wright, and this is his biography, his autobiography, his memoir, setting fire to his house to see the curtains burn, escaping to hide underneath the burning house. His mother brings the delirium of his mother beats him, and beats him to the degree that it brings a delirium of wobbly bags, threatening white fluids, bovine maternity, remaining days after, above his head, days after he regains consciousness. For a long time, I was chastened when I remembered my mother had come close to killing me. These words trigger the first outpouring of anaphora. This cluster evolves as a sleeping father tells him, he's been up all night, the father has, still no excuse, to kill the mewing kitten. And Wright takes his vengeance against the law of the father's voice by hanging the creature with a rope. The kitten gasps, claws, sputters. At this animal's funeral, his mother lines out the prayer her son is to repeat, including a riff on Jesus' plea, "Forgive me, for I know not what I was doing." And as his mother lines out this prayer, he cannot repeat the lines that would have him be hanged. "And while I sleep tonight, do not snatch the breath of life from me." I opened my mouth and no words came out. I pictured myself gasping for breath and dying in my sleep. This cluster abuts on a journey upriver to Memphis in a big white boat. The second cluster, centered again by anaphoric these outbursts, again abuts in immediacy on a journey. Here, as Wright and his mother board a train, the cars look alike, but he learns about line of color dividing white from black on the train. Wright wants to look at the white cars in the way that 1960s children in Birmingham wanted to turn on water fountains marked colored. We expected there to be a rainbow stream. Colors are neither accidental nor afterthoughts in Black Boy or in Wright's haiku. The second cluster that introduces this quote poetic outpouring. Richard Strick, then his grandmother bathes him without knowing the meaning of the words that he sang. The word anus is retrospective vocabulary, we could say, about this piece. Richard responds to the pleasure. He tells her, when you get through, kiss me back there. This time hiding under a bed instead of a house afire, Richard endures his second beating, and once again, this poetry is the destination, and the pages explode in this repetition of anaphora. Both of these ruptures are framed by Wright's listening. It's so lovely.
Sorry.
It's the angel's call. All right. Each event spoke. So they open with before you enter into this bizarre scape in the book. Each event spoke with a cryptic tongue, and the moments of living slowly revealed their coded meanings. The framing of this second burst responds to the first. The days and hours spoke now with a clearer tongue. Each experience had a sharp meaning of its own. The cryptic has become the clearer tongue. Coded meanings have become individualized, each with a sharp meaning of its own. This changes in the third anaphora, this third bizarre outpouring. Here, actuality for a Black boy is not being able to know from tongues or words. Up and down the wet or dusty street, the days and nights begin to spell out magic possibilities. Significantly, in this third cluster, Wright is not beaten. Instead, he experiences the chaos of actuality. His small and loved animal, Betsy, is killed by a coal truck. He cannot save his white dog from modernity. Critiqued by his mother for not having sold the dog to a white girl because she was white, he wouldn't sell it. She makes her case. You could have had $1. You can't eat a dead dog. Wright is silent. I did not answer. This not answering opens that flood of poetry. This third burst of anaphora does not speak of tongues or coded messages. Rather, this spate focuses on Richard's inability to control unexpected violence at any turn. In this last matrix or cluster, Wright realizes that he has always been running from the hellhound. Without ever having known a white person, the young Richard confesses that he had already suffered 1,000 lynchings. This third and last excess of anaphora and Black Boy closes with a prayer from a different sheet. Richard hears the story of a woman whose husband has been hanged. Being allowed to pray over his body, she bears what seems to be a pall in the tradition of the winding sheet. In seeming weaponizing God and prayer, she kills the mob of killers with a rifle hidden in the sheet. Through this heard story and later through that sharp-tongued Minkin, Wright understands that words are his weapon. His journey is through story. He keens toward the power of this woman who acts, who kills, knowing that she will be killed. Right, so basically, Birthed in the spoken, heard, and written word, Wright has survived through what he calls negative vitality. He is sustained, he becomes through ready listening and reading. Betsy's random slaughter culminates in his translated journey from fear to the power of the written word, spoken word. This third poetic verse ventures control of a world that cannot be controlled. Instead of the anaphoric opening, there was, with beautiful streams of poetry describing the rural countryside of Alabama and why Richard Wright called himself, he didn't call himself an expatriate, he called himself an exile. And as we read in the haiku, what he was in exile was from Natchez, from Jackson, from all the way upriver to Chicago and then New York. Right? So there was. Those are the first two excursions. It is this random animal slaughter that precipitates the third eruption. The earlier passages describe what was there was, including tree slaughter, plaintive sounds of dismembered and warping planks. They describe diabolical beauty. Here, in the third, these states of nature are no longer stable, they are conditional. This third anaphora, in which a man rather than a kitten is hanged, advances to the danger-laden causative of ifs. The if, then the then. These pages of if-then anaphora recount folk attempts to control the chaos of the inexplicable. Coal trucks killing small dogs are replaced by ways either to cause or avoid death. In East Thomas, at age 4, I stood at a spigot making grape Kool-Aid. The sugar was in the bottom of it, and when the spigot came on, it splashed purple and sticky up on my legs. Then a centipede walked by. And in Richard Wright's If I saw a nun and she counted my teeth, then I would die. Then I would die. Right? My story had been, if a centipede counts your teeth, you will die. And as my sister knows, I grinned at the centipede. And I want you to know that I fully expected to die at age 4. All right. So anyway, so these are quite wonderful runs for you to look at. Okay. So there's this effort of control, if with consequences, are answered by control, embodied by the woman praying with a gun. The anaphora of repeated ifs in a world amuck introduces hope for the vulnerable in a new tension or tense. Superstitions, prophylaxis. All right. There is a reason why Emily Dickinson wrote those 2,000 poems in 1862. Poetry amid violence can be a formal ritual, and it's very close to prayer, to control amid the chaos of killing or starving children. The pattern holds. Wright himself is nearly beaten to death in the first 2 clusters. The dream sequence matrices repeat the story of Wright as a vulnerable animal who can kill and be killed. In this third instance, the death of a small female animal and the lynched husband are linked. They're killed animals. Determining that he, like the kitten, Bluebeard's wives, and the hanged husband, will not die by the neck, Wright refuses to be cut. He refuses the Cartesian split that would make a black man into a body, not a mind. In the first 2 eruptions, he is given life by experiencing the more than human. Humans serve, persons write. They can write as Wright did to remember the crossroads of abused animality and the ever-present threat of death that might have seemed too dramatic for some of the critics. Formal feeling for Wright bounded by slavery's undying, death-dealing afterlife, is his release into poetry. Undivided, the Wright experiences these ruptures into anaphora as a wholeness. He's whole like animals. He's whole like animals in their cartographies of space, of smell, and of danger. Wright, venturing into the realm of the more than human, refuses to have his mind split from his body, even as he refuses calls to the body. He would rather eat a cold can of beans than be next to Bess's warm body in Memphis, a young, vital man. In his closing, written for 1945's Black Boy, Wright reminds, it had been through books at best, no more than vicarious transfusions, that I had managed to keep myself alive in a negatively vital way. Whenever my environment had failed to support or nourish me, I clutched at books. It had only been an accident that I had not killed or been killed. These outbursts toward poetry, these anaphora break through to the sonorous and the sensual. These lyrical lists do what AI, artificial intelligence, cannot do. They allude. Wright alludes here to Walt Whitman, to Charles Chestnut, to Faulkner, to unworried animals, and to sentient plants. These anaphora sing to him through what otherwise would be an unbearable life. These anaphora present the natural world. They break through in their extravagant difference to make unrelenting social realist constructions more real, to insist on Wright as a writer. Almost done. To return, anaphora returns. It goes back, it repeats. Metaphor takes one forward. Metaphor goes across. I'm not saying here that those are opposites of each other. Rather, I'm suggesting to you that they're a transitive bridge, some kind of transitive bridge in ways of political empowerment. Together, they structure a bridge inviting a sense of more than one direction. Yes, Wright's handmade book, Haiku, waxed oracular, headlining this other world. Aside from a few lines purchased by Ebony, this surprise poet received only rejection for his last words. Typecast, Wright died knowing that publishers were uninterested in anything other than his work on race, the provocations of his still banned and very much alive political and social interventions. 1960 would have been the time, but no one besides Woody Guthrie could have written a poetry for the people. Hannah Arendt, someone whom, she's no longer alive, someone whom I admire, could and did praise and parse past millennia. This was a past where the slaves and women could vote for which Greek tragedy or comedy spoke to them. They were able to look at a drama or a tragedy or a comedy and see how it reflected their lives and vote whether they felt that that reflected them. This poetry staged in amphitheaters went beyond labor. Labor is dishes. It used to be a long row to hoe. And it went beyond something called work. Work is where you produce something, whether of pride or not. Arendt wrote of a time when poetry alone among the arts and human endeavors was activism. Relevant in humor and human peccadillos and poignant deaths of daughter sacrifice, this performative speech of classical antiquity served poetry for listeners from all walks. Gentling into a questioning night, Wright's on the rise. Wright in 1959 and 60 may have written haiku in the way that Toni Morrison's dying baby Suggs of Beloved is hungry for color. How many of you read Beloved? You can read it with your hair standing on end. That's the way to read it. Hungry for color. Wright wrote in the haiku about weather, tormenting rain, mysteries of molasses, all kinds of crows and scarecrows. He wrote his haiku in unraging, not always unhurting syllables. There could have been a desire for something like a pure, unhurting aesthetic in these haiku. They managed to be political, a number of them in 17 syllables. All literature is political, as Kenny G says. All right. So that desire for something, pure, unhurting aesthetic. Baby Suggs says, "Show me pink," as she's dying. Show me pink. Baby Suggs wants color without narrative freight, without the weight of an afterlife. I have something personal to say here. I keen for Richard Wright to pleasure and form. I want him to thrill to a book that you all might read and some of you might be offended by, to thrill to Terence Hayes's Sonnets for My Past and Future Assassin, written in the first 200 days of the last takeover. Right. And I want this because Richard Wright would not have been alone in his rage, and his rage for order, his rage for poetry, and his rage for form. Thank you. So briefly, had we had a PowerPoint, you would have seen all these anaphora up there, and you would have strained your eyes trying to look at all of them. But
Yeah.
meanwhile, it's okay.
Why do you think we didn't have a PowerPoint?
I don't know.
Was it your son? No, I'm kidding.
No. You're my son, Kevin.
Thanks, Candace.
Thanks.
I like to
Thanks
think
for
that I am
acknowledging
too.
that, Tim.
And it was me. It was my fault. Yes. Well, Kenny, you want to hop
Sure.
up? And yeah, I think we can do like maybe 15 minutes for discussion.
Yeah.
So
Want me
you
to
wanna
sit there,
go ahead?
Kevin? Was that you were?
I could use it look like I've been jonesing this whole time. Like,
No,
Candace, can you
no,
sit in the
no,
other
no.
stool? Would you like to? That's how I originally pictured it.
I wanted
That's
to
not
do what you originally pictured. I really did, Kevin.
It's
All
gonna be
right.
your stool now.
Thank you for your time.
That's perfect. That frees me up to go move this chair out of the way of the bathroom.
Better when they can see what they send that for.
Yeah, so we just want to open the floor for any questions, comments, thoughts about any of the material or to either of our speakers. Again, a little round of applause. Thank you guys so much. Yeah. I will let y'all take it away. And I do have one, but I'm gonna wait for a minute.
I'll go. You spoke about Ellison being one of the more, shall we say, enlightened of identity politics. Could you, one, give us your view, which I'm sure you consider the most enlightened of identity politics, but I mean that in earnest, and why you consider him more enlightened?
Yeah, I knew I shouldn't. Yeah. Sure. What I admire about Ellison, and I think if you read The World in the Jug, you get a stronger sense of that. It's kind of what I hinted at in the paper. Well, let me just say, I feel like when I mentioned the quagmire of identity politics, I think that this is an issue that's currently racking the Democratic Party. They're trying to figure out what to do with that. There was all this post-election analysis looking at some bits of progress that Trump made with certain sectors of minority voters. So it's something that I think everybody's thinking about. What I admire about Ellison is what I mentioned in the paper, that he's very proud of his black culture and black heritage and black history, and he's very angry about the injustice that had been done to black Americans over the centuries of America's existence. But he's also looking for a path forward. He's looking for a way to, as he says in the final epilogue of Invisible Man, to balance his hate with love, to find something to protest, but also something to affirm, to try and hold those things in existence. And he's trying to carry that complexity and that hybridity and that tension over to his views of his pride and his black heritage as well, taking pride in it, but also recognizing that what it means to be black in America. According to Ellison, his argument is, yeah, there's certain sort of commonalities that most black Americans share, but what it means to be black, Ellison argues, can look different to different black Americans, and also that he argues black identity shouldn't be viewed as this siloed thing, that it's had this tremendous effect. If you view it as hybrid and sort of fluid, it's flowed beyond sort of its original communities, and it's shaped white, as he argues in his 1970 essay, it shaped white America as much as black America. And conversely, if you use the term African American, Ellison would put equal emphasis on both parts of that term, right? So I admire him trying to hold in tension love and hate, pride in one's ethnic heritage and unique cultural heritage, but also recognizing how it flows into a broader American story and made America what it was, and can create sort of intra-racial friendships and bonds and alliances.
And how does that correspond with your view? I don't think I got quite an answer. Former journalist, so.
Yeah, what's my view? Okay, I'll just be frank. I think certain strands in the Democratic Party have embraced these weird, cringy versions of identity politics that is not working for the Democratic Party. And I include myself among those leftists who think that we need to find areas of common ground between all working class Americans to make life better for all working class Americans. So, for instance, I'll just be frank, I liked Bernie Sanders. I think things like Medicare for all, things like subsidized daycare, things like cheaper higher education, those will disproportionately benefit minority groups, but it will benefit every working class American, and I will do so in ways in which I think are politically more feasible, because if it doesn't risk alienating certain voters. It I think has a better potential for creating interracial alliances rather than animosity.
Amen.
Is that fair?
I mean, I was curious about what it was the way you said it that made me pay attention to like how you phrased Ellison's view of identity politics, because again, no community is a monolith, and I think identity politics is especially having a moment here, a political moment, because as you see the backlash in voting, as we've shifted right, you're also seeing an uprising in discourse on far-right Twitter, shaped again around their version of identity politics.
Yeah.
And all that is going to have a conversation with the other. So I just found that a very timely.
Yeah. Well, I think
it is becoming like very politically fraught.
Yeah. Well, I think Ellison, maybe part of the reason I'm attracted to Ellison's vision of this is because it feels to me like he anticipated this idea that if you go with leftist identity politics, it could ironically cultivate rightward versions of the same identity politics that leads to unhealthy ground for the nation as a whole. That's a great question. Thank you.
Yeah, the Communist Party in Chicago, one of the reasons that Wright had a difficulty with it was that they would not allow people to, they didn't want to have black people lead or speak. There was this kind of just a reluctance of that, and also wanting to shape, what would be written, not only publishing things that went along with that. Meanwhile, Kenny, that was been a big mistake. But there are people that don't consider Oklahoma to be West, and
That's how Ellison frames it.
It's because what happened in 1907, and that's when Ellison's family went there, was that this was the first land rush that allowed people of color, and by that I mean people colored by class from the state of Alabama, so poor whites and black people of all classes, to go and have a stake there in 1907, around the time of Oklahoma statehood. So it's just, there was an infusion there of that. Anyway.
Yeah. Well, in one of his, the very first essay of Shadow and Act, this is his essay.
This is a whole, if he had done nothing else besides this book, he earns a place in literary, in letters, whatever that is.
He dedicated this to his English professor at Tuskegee, Morteza Sprague.
Yeah, it's a great book.
And in the very first essay, he outlines his vision of Oklahoma, which you can contest and poke holes in, right? I think that's fair. But for him, he says culturally everything was mixed, you see. He felt like there was more potential for intercultural and interracial mixture. He cites the unique sort of relationship between black Oklahomans and native Oklahomans, and oftentimes they would intermarry and they would sort of bounce between communities. And he says there were certain figures you weren't sure if they were native or black, and he liked that quality of Oklahoma. The fluidity
and a lot of those in Oklahoma were removed from where we are, not in this valley, but other valleys, and so that there is it's made up of Southern immigrants, largely. I mean, forced immigration and I think exile speaks for the state of Oklahoma, which I'm afraid I know too much about. Oklahoma has the largest native population in the United States. Second is California, because there was an Indian termination policy at the very time that this book was written. Indian cultural, an ending, an extermination policy of cultural extermination. Anyway, go ahead.
No, that's all I had. Yeah.
No, it's just.
Yeah, it's a great.
I once was writing my dissertation in a basement in the University of North Carolina, and the Gallup poll was saying, "Do you consider Oklahoma to be a southern state?" I heard
What's the Alabama
1,000 times. 1,000 times.
Yeah.
That I heard that there. The Alabama perspective on what?
On Oklahoma. Is it southern or western?
Oklahoma. Oklahoma's definitely southern. I mean, just unless you're just doing it according to which states were. I mean, I agree with Brother Malcolm. Any place south of the Canadian border is the South. Okay, all right. So you can forgive me on that or not, Kenny. We know each other. Yeah.
I just want to speak to the protest and the struggle, and how you struggle, especially with adversity that one does not embrace, is often caged in shame, and how these writers turn that into beauty, and that protest against shame and struggle. And I do know why, but as you both were talking, I kept thinking of Bukowski. Because for me, as a person in my 20s, when I was struggling, Bukowski was my lifeboat, and I see some of the same kind of ideas and use of violence and language, and what it means to be a person that does not quite fit, but yet still having pride in who you are.
This love of the folk culture, or admiration of the folk culture that Zora Neale Hurston had. And Zora Neale Hurston went so far as to not even approve of integration, because she felt that black culture was so powerful, wondrous, and was not as vacant, as empty as the other cultures, and that would, it's that idea that it would be the, not the saving remnant of the Bible, but that it would be something like that.
Yeah, a quote from The End of Invisible Man that I had to cut for time. Invisible says, "Must I then strive toward I'm trying to find it. Must I then strive toward colorlessness? What kind of existence would that be? Instead, he concludes something like America is made up of many strands. America is woven of many strands. Yeah.
I think the Albert Murray you mentioned earlier is even, I think, more direct on that.
Yeah.
I love it. I'm from Mobile, so I grew up in Albert Murray's backyard. But,
Cool.
But no, he says, he talks about, because Ellison quotes Heraclitus a few times in his writing about geography as fate, and Murray, though, says that, speaking of, from a sort of larger view, that poor blacks and whites resemble no one else in the world as much as they resemble themselves. Each other.
Yeah.
Inextricably mulatto is the phrase he uses, and I've always felt, growing up in Mobile, having family in New Orleans, it was, and I grew up in an all-black neighborhood. It felt that was the way I saw the world, and so Ellison and Albert Murray were two that I gravitated toward pretty early on. They were like Bukowski to you. They were like that to me. And so I privileged them a little bit more over Wright, who now I'm becoming to appreciate a little bit more. But yeah, that was my experience with it.
It's cool.
But yeah, I think both of them. I'm curious to. I guess my question leads into the question I had was. I've always felt that Murray and Wright would be useful in these cultural debates today, but that they would not really be appreciated by a lot of people that I would consider more on the left, because there's these terms like people that look like me, and that's the thing that's ingrained in people's head now. And I come from a background, I'm in my 40s now, so it's a little different. I grew up on the Paul Gilroy kind of attitude, where it's the opposite. Like, I grew up idolizing people like Richard Wright, and so it would seem to be incredibly limited if that's what I looked for, was they have to look like me.
Right.
Now that is sort of the cultural sort of paradigm, don't you feel that this stuff feels a bit passé or out of touch with how sensibilities are now? And have you encountered that as an educator?
At Sanford, no. Do they feel passé or out of touch? I don't know, because I don't, from the few, I got back onto Twitter very tentatively to see what the lefties are saying. And a lot of them are doing are either castigating the Democratic Party or doing soul searching themselves around these questions of sort of looks like me. Looking at the results of the 2024 election. But I think Wright and Murray feel passé in a useful way in that respect, that they're bringing something new to the table. And I was also, before this talk, I was trying to think, is there an intellectual today who's making similar arguments to Wright and Murray that's kind of unsettling liberals and conservatives and leftists alike with these visions of racial complexity and racial hybridity? I couldn't really think of one. Yeah. Can you?
Well, the ones that I do, unfortunately, seem to be what they call grifting a little bit. They're moving more to the right because there's money in that.
Yes.
I think you seem to have a little less esteem for Chatterton Williams as I have. I've only read one of his books, though. And I feel like a lot of these people, though, they seem to be drifting more and more.
That's my critique. I mean, he was the closest I thought of in terms of what he's actually arguing, but yes, I sense opportunism with how he approaches these issues.
Right.
And the right was
John McWhorter, but again, he's kind of,
right.
He's a little more in that direction as well.
Right.
Yeah.
You think of James Baldwin and then Ta-Nehisi Coates, the idea that there can be a letter to the child or a letter to the nephew, a letter to the nephew, my dungeon shook.
Yeah.
The idea of what is it that we're going to say to this generation that's coming along so that we don't continue on the path of a hellscape.
Yeah.
But meanwhile, Wright talks about whiteness. He said he could never understand the color because his grandmother was white, and he looked at these people who called themselves white, but he couldn't see what it was about. I mean, there's a book from the 60s that talks about first going into Africa and people in Africa seeing the European explorers and calling them yellow. I mean, this colorism phenotypism will only go so far. And it really fails when you're talking, well, it fails almost everywhere. I mean, it's, yeah.
I was gonna say something stupid. The Grant said this is. I was thinking about Drake when you were talking about sort of theorists of sort of mixed America, who's like so American that he's Canadian, and I think I think that's like part of what people hate about Drake. Actually, that Drake is like a Southern Black Jewish guy from Canada. And makes music that is like maddeningly for everyone. And like is sort of this embodiment of like an America that you can't really pin down. And it's like what Kendrick sniffed out about him is like who are you really? And I think people have that feeling about America too. Yeah. And that's like there's this we like distrust that about ourselves a little bit. Yeah.
That wasn't stupid.
In fact, it might be the perfect place to end.
Are there any more questions or queries?
Please don't.
I think we have to. I liked it. I felt like it was a relevant time. But yeah, well, thank you both again to our speakers. Thank you so much. If you have not, and I see a lot of people here on the contact sheet, and you are interested in getting information about our future events or getting involved, please make sure to sign up. But thank you guys so much for coming. Really appreciate it. And yeah, grab some more drinks and snacks before you go. Thank you guys. Thank you. Nice.
Fun. Almost
That was
together over
A lot of things to argue about.
Yeah, I know. I was
Oklahoma.
hoping we